One thing about Bendel's Hatchery, which is what this used to be, Carolyn and I have only had it for the last 25 years, is that it's intimate compared to Steve Street's place around the corner, or the other places are more open. We have pretty tight quarters up here on the arable land, and I'll mention what's going on with that. Is that the greatest part of it here? Okay, Janet's bringing up the rear. Good. The rear guard. Come on up, folks. Welcome. It's wonderful to have such a good showing to help support Haiti through the Paloma Institute. I thank you a lot for coming. Calling this place a farm is a misnomer. It's never been a farm. When the people that we inherited it from came here in 1915, they were homesteading, because the only buildings that existed was the Red Barn and the old farmhouse that Harry Moore lives in on Mountain View. And the rest of the 10 acres was all agricultural. That family came back in the 30s. The parents died and the daughter came back, and she came back with a young Idaho husband, and they came back in the 30s and started homesteading again. And this time the emphasis was on fruit trees. And so what I'm trying to say is this is not a working farm. Now, Steve Street's place and Russell and Kelly's place, these other places are much more working farms. We do a lot of trades with our neighbors. We're a community place. Mr. Bendel always used to say, we raise a third of it for ourselves, we raise a third of it for the neighbors, and the other third goes to the wildlife. And the wildlife is a major part of it, and it's become more wildlife than ever because we've had the reintroduction of squirrels. And they now get the walnuts before I get them, which I kind of resent, but they weren't here a mere 15 years ago. In '68, when it dropped to 50 below in Moscow, the squirrels froze out. And there were no squirrels here until 5 years ago, lately. So again, it's another cycle. In the same way, when the Sandberg family bought this place in 1915, they were told they'd be in the city by the end of the Great War. It's still not in the city. But Moscow used to, the post office for Hog Heaven was down at the corner of Damon and Mountain View, so it was only a mile to Moscow then, and now it's 2 miles to Moscow. So what I'd like to do is break you into two groups, and half of you will just stay with Carolyn, and the other half can start off with me, and it's almost like a serpentine route. I'll make some stops and talk about different buildings and things. I mentioned the 1908 barn that preceded the people that I got it from, but there's also the Yellow Mill, which was built in '42, right when war broke out, and it's one of the structures here that was built out of very short lengths of lumber, simply because that's what's available. Now it's used as a shop. It used to be the chicken batteries. When the baby chickens were little, they were all in there in huge chicken batteries.
What kind of mill?
It was a grain mill. There's still a big, and it was for grinding or pounding. I think it was a pounding, you know, like making oats into oatmeal. And it was strictly for chicken feed. And there's a sliding door that you'll see at the end of the tour, because that's where we hang the garlic and the onions to dry, and it's kind of beautiful to look in there and see them drying. And right behind there is the old grain mill. Don't ask me how it worked. In my lifetime, I've never seen it work. So, it's still there. Well, but it's not, check it out, but I don't see the apparatus. I only see the funnel, the huge funnel that you put the grain into. The skunks live under that building now. Well, they always have, at least in my lifetime. I came here first when I was 6. And so even though we didn't acquire it until 25 years ago, I've been here on and off all my life, and so I've seen these changes, not just to here, but to Moscow. Okay. Okay. All right, we're all going to go together, and we'll just make some significant stops, and we'll crowd in close, and So this is the house that Carolyn and I built. If you homestead a piece of land, the first thing you do is build a house or a place to live. Bendel's built their house up front in '52 after they'd been here 20 years because they lived in the old farmhouse for a long time. For those of you who are interested, when we get done with the tour, I'll talk more about the energy efficiency of the house and the way we built it and the way we designed it to be solar efficient, and the masonry stove that's in the basement that heats the house all winter long on one banana box full of firewood without pollution. So that's the first thing, is habitat for the people that are living here. Carolyn, you can add things if you want, if you're not willing to. So come along this way and we'll get to the new garden. You have here. Now we have 7.75. Almost an acre of that is in Yeoman's Lane, but this front part, there's the ancient farmhouse that was built in 1908, the same year as the barn was built. It's now being expanded after all the years. Like when Marcia Scheffler lived there, it was a much smaller building, but that was a mere 25 years ago. And so the front acre is no longer a part of the greater land, but the Bendel's legacy, that what they wanted to see this place carry on as it was when they acquired it, but on the other hand, they wanted to make it up to their foster children in some way or another. So it's very, very complicated, but now we've got the last 7.75 acres, and one of the things that we've concentrated on is permaculture. We went by an old grapevine that's coming back. It's been neglected for 30 years, and there's a new grapevine on the end of the house. And then, of course, the main permaculture feature of the garden here is the raspberry patch that dominates the whole garden and is at least twice as big as it was 10 years ago. Could I say that, Carolyn? It will not give up an inch, and it keeps moving relentlessly towards us. No matter how much we give it away and give it away and give it away, it keeps expanding this direction. And it's a jungle, but this has been its most productive year ever with all this rain. It was the, wonderful crop of raspberries. Behind it, towering over, are the old walnut trees that Carl planted back in the 30s. And what's amazing is that there's nowhere near the walnuts. Now that the squirrels are here, the walnut trees are getting old. I mean, standard trees don't last forever. A standard apple tree, there are 2 old apple trees that are 103 years old as the barn and the shed. But all the rest of the dwarf and semi-dwarf trees, they're also old. A semi-dwarf tree lasts 35 years. A dwarf tree lasts 50 years. So permaculture is not permanent. You have to keep recycling it. And when we go around, I'm going to cut across the garden and we're going to go around that way and into that area, you'll see young trees interspersed with ancient trees. And there's apple trees, there's cherry trees, there's, I say apple trees because there's so many yellow delicious and red delicious, but there were some apricot trees, only one's left. There are 2 pear trees. It's a cornucopia of permaculture that the Bendels planted all those years ago, and now it's not as productive as it was 10 years ago. They're old trees, they're tired out. Just like these buildings. That's the 1915 building that Marguerite's parents built when they first moved here, and then this is a 1934 building that was the first of the real chicken houses. And Harry Moore still has one chicken house that you can kind of see the shiny roof on over there. This was the site of a 2-story chicken house, and each story was this tall, and it was very dark, and it was very scary to go in there and gather the eggs because there were only 2 light bulbs in there, and when I was 6 years old, I try and get the eggs away from the old hens, and it was a challenge. So we tore it down, and it's the new garden because the old garden's covered by the utility shed of the neighbors. So a farm like this over a century is continually changing. Now we're going to leave the really, really best soil after we tour through the orchard, and we're going to go down the slope. And the slope is just nowhere near as good a soil because a lot of you people are standing on the plow line. The land was plowed down there where Margaret Dibble is standing. Thank you, Margaret. I could think school board, I couldn't think Dibble. And you see that dramatic difference there, and yet nobody has, that's been a hay field right up until we built the house a mere 15 years ago, and yet that plow line between where Dr. Boughton's standing and where Margaret is standing is a dramatic sign of what happens when you continually plow a place and all the land moves down the hill and then it washes down the stream. Well, we're trying to do things better now. The hayfield hasn't been hayed in years. Not that hay isn't permaculture compared to wheat. She asked a very good question. Can't we pick the walnuts before the squirrels get them? But you know, it doesn't work that way. It's like, that's like picking something commercially and sending it off to a warehouse on the way to a grocery store. I mean, part of the virtue of having your own walnut tree is that you go out and you shake the tree and the walnuts that are ready to fall will come down and you pick them up before the squirrels come down on the ground and get them. And we do that. It isn't like we let them have all of them, but they really high grade a lot of the walnuts, and they're very picky. We don't know which walnuts are good until we pick them and clean them, whereas the squirrels somehow inherently know that. So that's something new. Now here's something interesting. We have tons of pheasants right up until the last year, and we're not sure whether that's just, there is an overall pheasant population drop, but there used to be 10 acres of hay field and then grain field after the sheep were there next door to us, and now it's all in subdivision, and all of a sudden we have many, many more pheasants, and now we have zillions of quail because they're literally crowded here. We have the habitat here. The big monoculture farms do not, and the neighborhoods, you know, they have a lot of birds in their backyard, a lot of pheasants and quail, but it's not the same as the kind of foraging as here. So here, they eat the weed seeds. I mean, the only good thing about letting these seeds go to weed is because the birds get them. Carolyn and I have been working in the woods for 25 years, and as a result, we're never home in the summertime. You're seeing this place at its worst. It looks really great in the spring when the weeds haven't come back up again and when the grass isn't tall. But this is the time of year for the tour, and I think it still gives you an idea of what it's like to have a small acreage. Now, somebody asked about how many acres there were. We're now leaving the acres of arable soil, the red barn, the buildings where we started out, all of that's on the good soil, and now we're going down where the soil is not so good, but it grows great ponderosa pine trees, and we'll just take a short stroll through them and then loop around to the back to the road because I know you're running late, okay? I'm moving farther and farther so that everybody's out here in the open. Now this is your urban-rural interface, because 20 feet behind you folks is the city line. We're out here in the county in Idaho, and as you can see, it isn't very far to Moscow. So this is a change. In all these years, it's only been the last 7 years that parcel of 10 acres, it's sort of a mirror of this 10 acres, has been part of the city, and now it's got all these wonderful big houses with dogs. And people say, how did you get these trees to grow so fast? Well, we planted them years before the 10 acres was sold into being a subdivision. So we had a jump start on it because we wanted to plant permaculture and we wanted more trees right around Moscow. And so these were free ponderosa pines here. They're just stunted, but they'll take off eventually. And up there are ones that we bought from the university nursery. You'll see juniper. You'll see a big juniper in there. And in the background, very high up, you'll see a couple of Doug firs topping out amongst the ponderosas. And then down lower and out farther, you'll see larch trees. There's a bunch of larch trees at the end of Lanny Lane, which is the name of a dead-end road that comes there. And we have a little trail around there staying in the woods that all the neighbors use for dog walking. When you get up here, you'll notice apples dumped underneath the trees. That's for the birds. Once they're on the ground, we don't use them, so we bring them down here and give them to the birds. They belong to Nancy Lyle of the hospital board and all, and her daughters and her granddaughters. And so, and all we get for them is the poop. The poop is what we want them there for, and yeah, always great fertilizer.
Oh, they're llamas.
Oh, they're llamas.
Here's an example of what happened this winter. That big windstorm, neighbor's elm tree came down. Now it's curing for 2 years to be pushed through the masonry stove, just like all those grand fir rounds that you saw as you bicycled in. So the masonry stove loves donated wood, and I love getting wood that I don't have to haul in a fossil fuel rig to get home. So, works good. We're slowing down at the barn door here to admire the garlic and onions that are hanging there. They have to be stored out of the freezing weather in another month, but right now they're just adorable, air drying in there. If you don't want to try a piece of cherry pie, don't take one, because they're so small pieces. There's so many wonderful ones. The nice thing about the cherries is they're complete pie cherries. They are not sweet cherries, and so they have that wonderful tart flavor of a real cherry pie. And we started off with 3 of the trees that the Bendels left us, and even though they're still alive, it's all the root cuttings from those trees that have taken off, and they're all over the place now. And what we don't eat, the birds eat. So come on in and have a piece of pie.
Thanks.
Great fun.
There's one.
So they're cutting these pies up as quick as they can into littler pieces.
You guys want to share? Yeah. How about you share with me, okay?
Oh, one other thing to say about Bendels. You're going to all these other farms. Every farm you're going to has brought its chickens here, and we as a group have processed those birds and made them into frozen chickens. And so I mention that because we're the ancestors of the places that you're going next. This is one of the trays from the chicken hatcher. You keep a fertile egg in an incubator for 20 days, and on the 21st day, you put it into the hatcher. And there are 12 trays in the hatcher in the processing plant. Now that the baby chickens are no longer using them, we put plums in here, and dried plums, and apples, and cherries, and whatever we get our hands on, including bananas from elsewhere, because that's such a luxury to have a super huge food dryer out of an old piece of chicken processing equipment.